Hey Mama, I hope you are well. We are back with this week's episode of the Soul Mama podcast, and I am speaking to none other than Layla F. Saad. Layla F. Saad is a New York Times and Sunday Times bestselling author, podcaster, speaker, educator, and cultural worker for justice, healing, and liberation. She is the author of the groundbreaking anti-racism book, Me and White Supremacy, which has been downloaded by over 100,000 people when it was first issued as a free download. She's also authored the Young Readers edition of Me and White Supremacy. Layla has always sat at the unique intersection of different identities, Black, British, Muslim, also discovered lately as having ADHD and autism. She grew up in Wales, Tanzania, and England, and has lived in Qatar with her husband and 2 children for the last 25 years. She is passionate about social change, human well-being, spirituality, decolonization, and intergenerational liberation. Layla's work is rooted in the philosophy of becoming a good ancestor, using our lives and our bodies of work to practice justice and healing in ways that honor past generations and create change for current and future generations. So it was so important for me to bring Layla on to this podcast because her thinking about race and white supremacy has been instrumental in unpacking some of my own internalized conditioning around race. And when we're thinking about how, as mothers, we prepare our children to face a world that we know is unjust, that we know is not equal yet, how do we do that whilst protecting their innocence, whilst encouraging them to embody their full selves, their joy, their wisdom, their humanity, and to still stay safe in scenarios where harm can come to them, right? But it's such a challenge that we face as mothers of color. And so Layla and I speak about all of the different ways that we've overcome that in our own personal motherhood journeys, and ways that she recommends that other mothers can begin to ask themselves these questions to support our children and ourselves as we decolonize and divest from these ideologies that do not serve our wholeness and our fullness. So I really hope that you enjoy this conversation. Without further ado, here is Layla. So it's my pleasure today to welcome the one and only Layla Saad to the Soul Mama podcast. Welcome, Layla. How are you today?
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and I'm well. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
You have been on my mind for a very long time, especially around the work to do with conscious motherhood as a woman of color, supporting and serving Black and brown mothers. I was really invested in the voices of other women who are doing this work to shine a light on how we can still maintain our wholeness and our health and our vitality in a racist world. Your work has been instrumental to me and to, I know, many others. And so I'm just really grateful that you're here and we can get into this conversation. So thank you.
I love that so much. Thank you so much.
I wanted to begin with what I was reflecting on were the parallels between activism and motherhood as a Black and brown mother, because you describe the kind of cycles of burnout that activists can feel, where they are trying to live into a reality that is not yet here, because there is still the legacy of white supremacy, of capitalism, of patriarchy, and we're aware of it, but we are trying consciously to push into a new reality. And so because of that, people get into these cycles of burnout. And I've been very aware that Black and brown mothers are also experiencing these cycles of maternal burnout, because we are also trying to imagine a world for our children that doesn't yet exist. And so we end up carrying that burden, often alone, and ending up feeling really burnt out. And so I wondered if you had any thoughts on those parallels and what words of wisdom you might pour in to women who are experiencing that cycle of burnout in motherhood.
That's really a powerful question, because I think it's not just that we're living with the legacy of these things, we're living with their actuality in the present moment, right? So we're holding 2 dual ways of being at the same time. We're trying to release one while actively trying to birth or create or live into another. And as both activists and mothers and parents, I feel like we have to contend with the fact that the world that we live in now, we have to deal with it as it is. We live in a capitalist world. There's no two ways about it. We live in a world that is not only carrying the legacy of colonialism and white supremacy, but is actively perpetrating it. These systems of supremacy also live within us,
Right.
have been carried intergenerationally through us. And for many of us, as my friend Dr. Marielle Bouquet likes to say, we're cycle breakers, right? So we're also in the process of like breaking the cycle within us,
Right.
hoping that what we pass on for the future is something a bit more whole, a bit more healed, a bit more liberated. It's like we're trying to pull from the past what has worked from Indigenous culture, from community culture. We're trying to pull from that and ground ourselves in that. And at the same time, we know that we're living in a world that is accelerating in technological development
Right.
way faster than our bodies and our brains are able to keep up with. And so we're trying to prepare ourselves for it. We're trying to live into it. And we're trying to prepare our children for it. And it's just a lot to juggle. And I think on both sides, or whether we're talking about activism, whether we're talking about motherhood, and also we know ourselves as mothers who are activists, right? But we're holding it all at the same time. I think that it's so important for us to really have a lot of grace and gentleness with ourselves, because we want to make sure that what we're passing along intergenerationally is not trauma, is not harm. And at the same time, it's really hard on us. You know, it's really hard on our bodies. It's really hard on our minds. And we're doing the best that we can, that we're able to. And I feel like when we try and take it all on, like, I'm going to be the cycle breaker, I'm going to be the one through which my body and through which my mind, everything changes, it's very easy to cross the line from somebody who's trying to be active as a change maker versus someone who is almost martyring themselves, almost coming into saviorism and using ourselves as like, it doesn't matter what happens to me as long as what happens next is better. I had to really divest from that way of thinking, because that is very much how my activist journey started out. I was so overcome and overwhelmed by how terrible everything is and how much everything needed to change, that I just thought, I have to throw myself whole into this, that every part of me has to be about this. And I really did not consider the toll that it would take on me until I found myself in a place where not only was I physically burned out, but I was becoming someone I didn't really like very much. I was becoming someone that was quite pessimistic, always expecting things to be terrible. I didn't really have space for hope. I was always waiting for like the other shoe to drop, or the thing to be revealed where everything is terrible. And I think as both activists and mothers, when we lose the spaciousness in ourselves to be curious, to be open, to dream that another way is possible, right? It's like we become like Audre Lorde talked about, right? We start using the master's tools almost against ourselves. And the very thing that we're trying not to do is what we end up doing inadvertently.
Exactly.
And so I had to kind of change my mindset to one where I had to include myself in the liberation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I had to be like, I only get one life. I only get one chance here. And if I spend it all only trying to serve other people, then what happens to me? And is that a lesson I want to pass along to my children?
That part.
Is that like something that I think is helpful for them to take upon themselves?
Exactly.
So many have said this. I think it was Maya Angelou quoting James Baldwin and saying that your crown has already been paid for. Like, the work has already been done. A lot of the work has already been done by the ancestors who have come before us. So for us not to include ourselves in the liberation, thinking we have to keep subjugating ourselves as a way that we're showing that we're continuing to hold the mantle, I think it becomes something that's very self-destructive and something that doesn't allow us to live into that liberated world that we want to live. But, you know, it's very hard. It's very hard to disconnect from that. I'll say it as someone who, it took ages for me. So And I still fall into it.
I appreciate that, because I think we could think there is a right way to be as mothers and there is a right way to be as activists. The fact that that's a lot to carry and that we don't
Yes.
have to martyr ourselves. I'm so glad that you use that language, because I've seen it time and time again with the women that I serve. There is this kind of awakening, or what I call like the lifting of the veil, when we become pregnant, when we've conceived our children and we've given birth to them. And then all of a sudden there's this overwhelming responsibility of, we need to protect these Black and brown babies, because all of the things that I have navigated as an adult, I do not in any way, shape, or form want this to be projected onto my innocent, precious child who I've gone through all of this labor to birth and to bring into the world. And so all of a sudden there is the overwhelm of that responsibility. How am I going to protect them from all of this? And so that can be the momentum that kind of shifts us into, I must fix everything now.
Yes.
Because there's an urgency all of a sudden that perhaps we might not have had prior to having children. I know that was the experience for me. It was like there was an awareness, but there's an acceptance that this is how it is and this is where we're at. But when I became a mother, it was like, oh no, I can't allow this to continue if I'm going to have my children in the world.
Yes.
And so that pressure can lead to, I'm going to do all the things. I'm going to read all the books. I'm going to heal all the trauma. I'm going to fix everything for everyone so that there is this non-passing on of harm or of negative cycles, whilst also navigating all of the changes, emotional, spiritual, physical, that happen when you become a mother. That's a lot to handle, which is what leads to this burnout and this exhaustion and overwhelm that a lot of women experience, which is like, I can't carry it by myself, let alone the fact that most of us are doing that within nuclear family homes, or many in single parent family homes. And so there isn't even the support that comes from the indigenous structure of the village to say, we're all doing this together. We're looking after this child together. So all of that on top is then like, how do we bring ourselves into the liberation of it? How do we recognize that the system is still not caught up to our dreams and to our desires?
I will say it's very hard. And I really don't want to give any kind of like platitudes or canned answers, because we live in a world where raising free Black and brown children is very dangerous to the status quo. And free Black and brown children really threaten a lot of adults of all races, especially when they're a certain age and they're quite young. They're kind of like in the safety of our home and we can control everything. As they start to get older and begin to interact with these institutions, schools, and things of that nature, and if we raise them to be really liberated in how they see themselves and how they see the structures of the world, it's really threatening to the status quo. And we're often having to think about, like, I want them to understand this, but I also want them to understand how to protect themselves when something pops off. I want them to be able to like name racism or whatever systems of supremacy are at play, but I also don't want them to be burdened with thinking about that all the time. And it's very, very tough. And that's why I go back to that, giving ourselves grace and being gentle, because this whole journey from the parent side and the children's side is like, all of us have never done this. We're all doing it all for the first time. There's not a clear blueprint, and especially one that's the same for everyone, of how everyone should be doing this whole thing. Like you said, we all come from different kinds of families. We all come from different kinds of cultures. And so instead of thinking, I should be doing it like this person or like this family, it's really about, I think, as a family, no matter how big or small that family is, no matter how many family members are in that family, deciding together, what is liberation for us? What does it mean? And that's not just like a sit down conversation. Parenthood is very much like things happen and then we have to deal with it in the process. You know, things are going on. And then as we're going through it, we have to deal with it. And I think we live with a lot of the time, a lot of regret, a lot of like, I should have done it this way. I should have known. If I look back now, you know, how I was as a parent 5 years ago, 10 years ago, I should have been able to figure that out. And it's like, well, how could you have? You didn't know.
You only know what you know. Yeah, exactly.
You only know what you know. And I kind of go back to like misconceptions around activism. And I want to reference my friend Kari Williams, who wrote the book Micro Activism, because she really helped me to like claim that label of activist in a way that before I was like, they don't call me an activist. I was like, no. I'm not an activist. An activist is someone who's like on the front line,
Right.
risking everything in their life. And I realized that that's such a cop out, because then it takes away from me contributing in whatever ways I can and am able to. And it makes it so that people who are doing that kind of frontline work are having to bear the full burden, while the rest of us can say, well, they're the real activists and we're not.
Right. And so speak to me about microactivism. What does that look like?
Yes. Microactivism is about recognizing that it's not about doing the big things. You don't have to have a bullhorn, as Amkari says. You don't have to have the biggest platform. You don't have to start a movement. It doesn't have to be that way in order for it to be life-changing for the culture. And the culture can be a microculture, which is your family, right? Or it can be the culture, right? And have that ripple effect outwards. But each of us are here to contribute in some way. And I really value being intentional about understanding the ways in which we choose to contribute. I have a course called Claim Your Space, and I talk about, understanding like who you are, what your positionality is, and what your skills and talents are, and who is the community that you want to serve, and what talents or gifts can you bring into that space. It could be a donation, absolutely, right? But it could be like, I'm really good at writing letters. And, there's this particular issue that's happening, and I'm going to create templates for people to make it easier for them so that they can, write these letters. Or I'm really good at holding space for people. I'm going to make it so that there are those community gatherings.
Yeah.
And that becomes your way. I think it really is about the intentionality behind it and understanding this contribution that I'm making is my activism, is the way that I'm choosing to contribute. And that doesn't mean when a crisis is happening, we say, well, I don't need to speak up about that because I'm doing my activism over here. But it does mean that when that crisis is happening and it completely devastates us, as it's designed to do, and makes us fall into despair and makes us want to disengage, that we remember that there is something I'm actively doing on this side, and that's helping to contribute. And so bringing this back to what you talk about, I really believe that parenting in general is a form of activism, but especially parenting Black and Brown children is absolutely activism, because how could it not be? We live in a world in which who our children are, what their identities are, has never been fully valued. They've never been seen as fully whole. We know that coming up as young Black children and Brown children. Yeah. And we know that, yes, some things have changed from our generation to theirs, but a lot has just evolved and become different. We're finding ourselves having the same heartbreaking conversations that our parents had to have with us. Now, the conversations may be different, but the issue that's come up is usually the same.
You said that your course was called Claim Your Space. And that idea that, if we're raising children to be their full, whole selves, we want them to take up as much space as they are here to do, right?
Yes.
As they can. And yet we perhaps have come from a generation where taking up space was the difference between life and death. And so there was a really strong push against you being too loud or too bold or speaking up or, being perceived as dangerous, right? To those who had power and those who could actually bring you harm, if not death. And so in this generation, I think we're at this really interesting intersection because we've been raised with those messages. And so we've perhaps internalized a lot of that in our own kind of desires to stay small or to stay hidden, to stay safe. But then we want our children to take up perhaps more space than we've had permission to take up. And then we're also aware that it's still potentially dangerous, depending on where you're living and the political climate and where your child goes to school and what age they are and the lightness or darkness of their skin. They're going to be at greater or lesser risk of harm. And so how can we give our children permission to take up space when the world is still not a safe place for Black and Brown children?
I really love what you said, though, around sometimes we want them to take up more space than even they want to, almost like an overcompensating for what we didn't get to have. And like, trying to live vicariously through them in some way. And so I think that's a really important thing to say, because I think while there may have been, and there were certain pressures that were on us growing up, that we had to be twice as good in order to be seen, we may be, in ways that we may not realize it, trying to put a similar kind of pressure on them, where it's like, it's important for you to be seen because we haven't been seen historically. And maybe they're just not interested. You know what I mean? They just want to be like, whatever. That, I think, really speaks to like the trap of like Black excellence and representation as an answer for like real justice, right? And so we want to be careful not to pass along that message, because it's very insidious.
Okay.
On the surface of it, it doesn't seem like that's an issue, but it is. That our kids be whatever it is they want to be. As somebody who was raised as an overachiever, at 40 years old, I'm exhausted.
Right.
Recently discovered I'm neurodivergent. I'm like, wow. So I was like working many times as hard. Right?
Exactly. Especially at that time where there was not the awareness or the support or the resources that there are now for neurodivergence.
Yes. So I'm tired. So let us be mediocre if we want to be, right? and then to your question, how do we make it so that they feel safe enough to do that and to be that? I think it's the balance of not allowing what's internalized within us, the kind of like smallness a lot of the times that gets internalized within us, to make them feel like the parameters are smaller as well, to give them that spaciousness in our relationship with them, in what they want to explore, what they want to do, how they are in their bodies when we are with them, right? In our homes, in our spaces, while also as they grow up and having, age appropriate conversations with them, helping them to see and understand, oh, that's interesting, because do you notice this, and that, and the other, right? So I do this all the time. I was watching a series with my teenager recently, a kids series, like a family series. And I said to her, it's really interesting because most of the people in this show are people of color. Like, nearly all of the protagonists, except the main protagonists, were people of color, and a mixture of people of color as well. And I said, that's really interesting, because growing up in the 90s, all of the family shows with the kids, they were all white, and even that, like a very specific kind of white, even within that. Right?
Yeah. Very narrow representation.
Very, very narrow.
Yeah.
And so I bring her back to this again and again, like when I notice things in pop culture, when we're just together, because I want her to develop the skill of critical thinking and noticing, even though things are better, noticing like, within a short period, that's not how it was. It was actually like this, and now it's become like this. But notice that even within this, the main protagonist is still white.
So almost giving your daughter the language and the perspective to be able to notice the nuance for herself.
Absolutely.
And not necessarily needing to place onto her the burden of the historical realities that we might have needed to navigate. And that's a really interesting dynamic, because we have been very conscious about the types of media that we expose our children to. And we've been very clear on the fact that we don't want them consuming things that compound the idea of only a white family that's happy, or a white perfect Barbie life that is not reality and it's not steeped in grounded culture, right? And so my daughter, from a very young age, had a language that she kind of shorthanded to, oh, if it's not brown, we're not going to watch it. Right. And I was like, one, we can't say outside of this house, but two, it's deeper than that. But I'm wanting to almost balance your perception, because I know when you're exposed to the school system that they're not countering that with diversity in terms of their books or their materials or their representation. And she happens to be in a majority white school. So for me, it's been really important to kind of make sure her dolls, all of the focuses in our home in terms of art and food and culture are all very Black and grounded in that. Yeah. But I've noticed that it then kind of makes her perception a little bit skewed. And so I wonder how you've given your children at the younger ages the vocabulary or the awareness to notice difference, and to also have an awareness of history without needing to be angry or rageful or shameful
about
Yes.
anything that has actually happened while still being able to maintain healthy dynamics with white peers.
Absolutely. I'm smiling because I have two kids, and my son, who's younger, I'm pretty sure is neurodivergent. He's very literal like me. So in times that I've had conversations with both of them about things that have happened, because he's younger and because of the way his mind thinks, he sometimes comes to those very kinds of conclusions and is like, so you just don't like white people? And I'm like,
Right.
no, that's not what I'm saying. Okay, at all. But it's that repeated, like trying to add this piece and add that piece so that it's a more fuller picture. But it does take time because their brains are younger. They work differently than ours. They draw conclusions that we aren't sometimes expecting because we're like, we didn't say that. That's not what we said. And so it's going back in again and again and kind of like refining and fine-tuning that understanding.
Yes.
Yeah, it's hard to know in advance how they're going to take it, what conclusion they're going to come to.
Right.
This is why it's so important to be making a conscious effort to have these conversations, whether or not it relates to something terrible that's happened. And I think that's where a lot of the times, if we're not having conversations where it's like not a high risk situation, you know what I mean? It's not like a high emotion situation. If we're only having the conversation when that happens, that's when things can get really compounded because it's like, there's a lot of emotion. I don't know what's happening.
And we don't have a language for it because we haven't touched the subject before.
Right.
But I feel like as Black and brown mothers, we are constantly aware of this kind of potential for racism or for things to happen in the school system or in the nursery or in the playground. And so there's almost like this tentativeness of not wanting to pass down an inevitability because for me, one of the conscious thoughts I had was just because I experienced racism at school does not mean necessarily that you will in the ways that I did. So I don't want to almost predetermine that you will, that you're going to go in looking for anybody to kind of be a particular way, because then that takes away from your experience of having, an actual genuinely good time in your education and in your friendship groups. However, there is the constant layer of decoding that is happening when a teacher will say something seemingly quite innocent, like, your son was playing quite aggressively today. And I'm hearing 3 layers of conversation there, like, he's the only brown boy in his class.
Yes.
What does aggressive mean to you?
Yes.
Have you said this to anyone else? Why is his behavior being questioned? And, all of those questions are happening before I give a response in the moment. And so I'm very aware that there's my understanding, my awareness, but there's also the need to want to give them like a space of freedom where they don't need to internalize the position of being in victim mode.
Yeah.
I'm really struggling with that because I've seen, even at the young ages, there were girls in the playground who were white, who definitely were embodying tropes of like white fragility without knowing that that's what they were doing. And then my daughter would come back and be like, this happened and I spoke up about it, but so-and-so started crying, and then everybody rallied around her. And I'm like, this is where it begins. And me and my husband looking at each other, and I'm like, okay, so how are we going to break this to her? And it's like, we're having this like multiple layered experience for something that she's seeing as an isolated incident that happened. So how do we navigate those situations where there's so many layers of history, but you don't want it to take away from their experience of having a happy, healthy childhood?
First of all, it's not just your experience that you're carrying. It's like you said, history. So it's your own personal experience. It's the experience of your ancestors. And then these things have been studied. There are statistics for them. Like, this is not an imagined thing. The adultification of Black children is not an imagined thing. These are very real things. And so when we are proactively taking the initiative to have these conversations, to prepare them for these kinds of things, we're preparing them for things that are real, that exist, right? So it can be hard because we don't want to take away their sense of innocence.
That's exactly what I was trying to say.
We don't want them to feel like, oh, so everywhere I go, someone is watching me, something is happening. But I will say, especially for those kids who are in predominantly white spaces, they are experiencing it anyway. They just don't have the words for it. There's so much that I look back on and I think about, wow, like the thinking that I had at 7, 8, 9 years old about what was happening around me was actually pretty accurate. but
Right.
no one was giving me the historical and cultural context. I could just feel like I'm being made to feel small here. I'm being left out here. I'm being targeted in some way here. But there was nobody telling me this is what's happening. Or if they were telling me, they were not giving me a real kind of breakdown of why this is the case. And so the conclusions that we come to draw from that is, well, because being Black is not great. Right? That's what happens as a child. That's the conclusion you end up drawing. You don't draw the conclusion that everybody else must have something wrong with them.
Exactly.
Because they're the majority and you're the minority. You're the one who's different.
Exactly.
My school, a secondary school, decided to show the whole class Roots as part of a history lesson. And we watched the whole series. And there were, I think, maybe 3 white girls in that class, and the rest were Black and brown. And the amount of rage and anger that came up as a result of having watched that for people who perhaps didn't have the context or whose parents had not given them that education.
Yeah.
And the shame that the white girls felt, which was almost like, swallow me up in a hole right now. And I was just so aware that, one, it's almost irresponsible to give education in that way without tools of how to then manage your emotion and to navigate the reality that we're in now and to sit with the reality that happened then. I felt like they kind of just left it there. And so I've always been really conscious, like, I don't necessarily want to show her all of the things that I was shown without a foundation in Blackness being really a positive, healthy, vibrant experience to counterbalance that kind of narrative, which is still real and it's still important to know, but it can leave you feeling overwhelmingly small or overwhelmingly angry or the range in between, which is then still problematic because it's like, and now what do I do with all of this emotion? And so I wonder what your thoughts are on how we actually teach history to our children in a way that doesn't send them in a spiraling path that is not going to be helpful for them.
I'll be honest, and I loved history. And to now, when I write, like, I want to understand history to understand what I'm writing about. I will be very careful with my wording. I think because the shift from how history has been taught in schools, right? I also come from a British educational background. So I don't remember learning about colonization. I don't remember learning about Africa at all beyond kind of like a slavery perspective.
It's still the same.
Right. I don't necessarily think that the people who are teaching it are always prepared themselves to teach it in a way that is, like you said, able to hold all of those things. I feel like history was always taught in a way where it was something that was so far away. We know that that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
The way that I feel like it was taught was like, that was back then and it was terrible, but thank goodness we don't do that anymore. And this is the modern world we have.
Right.
And I feel like the shift towards even including now any kind of analysis or conversation around these systems, there's so much of a gap that we as Black and brown parents still have to fill in. There's like missing gaps of information and missing like gaps of analysis to understand this didn't happen to these people because they were naturally inferior. This happened because these other people wanted power and had a supremacist mindset. And this is what it was really about. And that those effects still live on today and those ways of being still live on today. But I do feel that it's very important to like titrate that information to our kids, not like fire hosing them with everything.
Yeah.
Because it's too much. It's a lot for us, even though we know it. And still when we find things out or when something terrible happens, we're still shocked. Not because we're shocked that it's happened, but shocked that this kind of dehumanization is happening. Dehumanization of any sort is a shock to the system, naturally.
Yeah.
If your heart is open, if you're an empathic person, like it's going to affect you in some way. And so to the other piece I wanted to say as well is that around protecting that innocence, we could have a whole separate conversation around the effort that's made to protecting white kids' racial innocence. And really, unless their parents or adults around them are in the work themselves, they're not usually passing on I think it's very unfair to not give them the tools and the language to be able to understand who they are first and foremost, and then the power dynamics that are at play in the world, right? I think it often leads to white kids and white people putting their brown and black counterparts in situations where their brown and black friends have to in some way self-betray or laugh off something that's happened that's actually really hurt them, or in some way have to prioritize and their white friends' feelings over their own. And then these become patterns that we then grow into. So the example that you gave of like the kids who started crying, and I point them out. I say, well, this is why. I know it's not very nice, but this is a dynamic that's happening and it will be allowed to happen.
Yeah. And it's such a tension because it's like you said, if those parents are not doing the work, which most of the time they're not, let's be honest, because that's why racism continues, because there are these unspoken entitlements that people are feeling and having reinforced constantly. So if they're not having those conversations and their kids are able to just navigate their childhood innocently without having to think about all of the atrocities that have happened in the past or in their ancestral line or in their family dynamic, then it's like, why are we burdening our children with that responsibility, which then compounds the very dynamic that we're trying to step away from, which is that we take responsibility for fixing the dynamic that has already been put in place generations before us when we're not the ones to fix that.
So I have this workshop on raising anti-racist kids. And one of the things that I talk about, because I think this concern about how early is too early to speak to our kids about this, what do I actually say to them? And, we have to go with the age of the development of their understanding of like themselves as a separate person, the world, all of those things. You can't, like I said, fire hose a very young person with something that is too old for them to understand. There are stages to this. But the other piece, I think, and this goes for all kids of all races, all families of all cultures, I think it's important to have two things in our conversations with our kids. I think we have to have conversations that instill a sense of cultural pride, right? And this is whether you're white, you're black, you're brown, like really knowing your culture, understanding it, taking pride in it. And at the same time, also instilling a sense of cultural accountability. And so that speaks to understanding what are the privileges that we do hold. What are ways in which perhaps our ancestors have caused harm? Race is just one of the aspects we're talking about. There's class, there's colorism, there's disability, there's cis hetero, everything. There's
all the intersections.
All of us hold privilege and power in some way, and all of us in some way also experience a sense of marginalization and discrimination. And so that cultural accountability balances the cultural pride, so that the pride really buffers us against a sense of shame or against a sense of like, well, I'm white. That means, I have to feel terrible for everything that's happened through white people, or I'm black and I have to feel this sense of like shame about what's happened to my people. No, like have real pride about who you are, but at the same time, also understand that we also impact other people in other ways. And it's important for us as parents to have conversations with them to help them understand the wider context of who we are and what impact that may have had on other people, and that impact carries through into today. And then through these low risk conversations, right, pointing these things out and helping them to understand, you do notice this? When we see that, we have to make sure that we don't perpetuate that. You notice this? Isn't that interesting how they've done that? Why do you think that that's the case?
Definitely.
Right? And really asking questions. I think it's often surprising when we ask kids questions to see what it is that they think or what it is that they understand. and then correcting any misinformation.
Yeah,
Right? Yeah.
that's a good way of doing it. And unfortunately, the world gives us so many examples to be able to do that on a day by day by day basis. We went to an art exhibition and we're walking through the Renaissance walls. And I'm like, who do you notice is here? Who do you notice is not here? Why do you think they've depicted Jesus in this way when Jesus
Yes.
was from this place of the world where
Yes.
people did not look like this? Do you know, and we have those conversations on almost a constant basis because media and life is giving us those examples all the time. And so I think developing that critical voice, that critical lens where you're encouraging your children to be aware and to be conscious, it can be done in these micro moments, which don't need to feel traumatic. Because I know I definitely felt the fire hose effect. I'm coming from a white British mother and a black Rasta Caribbean father. And I remember the moment, it was like my first day of reception, and a white girl said, "Oh, you're not allowed to play with us. You're black." And I was like, "No, I'm not." And I came home and I was like, "Mom, this girl says I'm black." And she was like, "Oh, turn to my dad. How do we have this conversation?" And my dad was like, "Well, technically, Nahanda, if we were in slavery times, you'd be in the house, but I'd be in the field." And I was like,
right.
Okay.
Right. Wow.
What do I do? What do I do with this?
Yes.
Because it was like, you're experiencing a privilege that I'm not experiencing as a dark-skinned black man, but you're not privileged enough to be, at the top of the hierarchical ladder.
Yes.
And I just remember having this existential crisis at 5, just thinking like, oh my gosh, I really thought I was a whole person. And now I'm having to conform to the expectations and the smallness that people expect of me, whilst also navigating the fact that that's also a privilege in compared to my dark-skinned friends and family. But also recognizing that the internalization of white supremacist ideals were playing out in the comments that my grandmother would say, who was in Grenada at the time, when I would go to visit, where she'd be like, "Don't get your skin dark up in the sun. Make sure you keep your skin light. Look how your hair nice." There was don't lose your privilege.
Yes.
And that I felt so conflicted. Sometimes the eternalization of the white supremacist ideas in Black parents can still compound how they go on to parent their Black children.
Yeah.
How do we speak to that?
So if we're talking about stages and talking to children, when you say to kids, "You're Black," they don't know what you're talking about. They're looking at the Crayola crayons and they're like, "This is the color black.
Exactly.
I am not this
I'm
color."
brown. Yeah, exactly.
So there's that, he's not white, he's peach. What are you talking about? Right.
True.
So I think first, before even talking about the social construct of race, we have to talk about melanin, just at its most simple, right? The difference of how we have different shades and how that happens biologically, and noticing it and not assigning value to anything, right? Just noticing it in the same way that we notice the difference in Crayola crayons, right? And so that starts at that younger age. And then as we build upon, we then start talking about, well, people who are this color are usually called Black. So you may not be Black, but you're usually called Black, or you might be called brown, or you might be called white, even though it doesn't. And that will take them some time because they won't understand why. And then as they get older, this is what I found very hard, especially with my son, trying to explain the difference between, there's only one human race.
Right.
There are no different races. There is one human race. We're all connected. We all come from the same ancestors in the end.
Yeah.
Right. And you notice how we look different. We have different cultures. We have different religions. And so then explaining the difference between race, ethnicity, culture, nationality, which as a third culture kid, I really needed to understand these things because I just didn't.
The nuance.
I understood them later as an adult. I'm raising third culture kids. So it's been helpful for me to do that, because I remember the first time someone asked them where they were from, and they said, we're from Qatar. We're Qatari. We live in Qatar. And I'm like, "You're not Qatari. You're not Qatari. Who told you this?"
Yeah.
And so then having to explain, well, actually, we've got Zanzibari and Kenyan, but we're also Omani, but we're also British, and we're also Irish. So there's all of these different things mixed together. And some of it is our ethnicity, some of it's our culture. But still, even within that, if they're still at that young age, it's not necessarily the time to start explaining about the history of colonialism, right? It's maybe a bit early, but we want them to start understanding what these words are. Bell Hooks talked about this, and Paulo Freire, around how education is a practice of liberation. And so the more education we give them, and again, plugging these gaps that are not given through school, because people are too scared to talk about difference. Let's just pretend we're all the same.
Exactly.
And we don't have any difference between them, and we don't see color. We don't see anything. So
this is so unhelpful.
Very unhelpful, because then kids are left to their own devices to try to make sense of the inequities that they are seeing. They're trying to understand what they're seeing, and nobody is giving them language and tools to understand it. So that's our responsibility. Okay, so you're learning this in school. Let me talk to you about that, right?
Yeah. What I'm hearing is that need for double education. It's like, this is what you're being taught, and then we're going to deconstruct that when we get home. We're going to critically analyze that. We're going to give you the actual context. We're going to give you the actual information and provide some alternative points that you can get into this subject about that they will not be teaching you in school. And I think that is so important.
But this goes then back to why parenting free Black and brown kids is so dangerous to the status quo, because we're essentially giving them information that their teachers are not giving them. And they may go into the school, and depending on their personalities, go into the school and challenge what they're being taught.
That was me,
right?
All day. Actually, my mum said, It's so true.
So if the way that they teach education is very hierarchical, or if they feel very threatened by more of an equal exchange, that's where then troubles can start to arise.
Yeah.
And that child can be labeled a troublemaker, aggressive. And so this is where then, as we give our kids this education, which is a practice of liberation and freedom, we also need to be preparing ourselves and preparing them to understand that people might give you pushback, because actually I'm teaching you this, but a lot of other parents may not be teaching their kids this.
And so I'm curious, in that example that you just shared, if your child came back and said, I spoke the truth, but my teacher spoke me down, do you come back with you need to play the game, just give them the answer they need to get the mark and let's move on? Or are you like, no, they need to understand, I will show them the references, they need to teach this correctly? Like, where are you at on that scale?
I think because my kids are quite polite and quite shy, so they've not done that. But I know that if they did, and if that's what happened, if the teacher countered back with, shush, be quiet, you don't know what you're talking about. Oh, I would, because I'm mama bear, that's it's going to come out. And I know what I'm talking about, right?
Exactly.
So I would ask to have a conversation. I would say, this is what she's told me, or he's told me. Is that what happened? How did you see it? Why was that the case? Because they are still a child.
Yeah.
And when someone in authority says, you don't know what you're talking about, and they feel like, actually, I don't. I'm just saying what my mom told me or my dad told me. We need to have their back. That's really important, because as we have their back, we're teaching them that you have permission to speak. You have permission to take up space. You don't have to deal with, and this is especially the case with dealing with white teachers, but I will also say the school in itself is an institution, right? So speaking to institutions, regardless of the race of the teachers, that's a skill that you want to develop. We want to develop a sense of self for you. Now, we want to make sure that you're doing it respectfully, right? We want to make sure that, you're not trying to cause trouble, right? You're trying to be respectful. But if you've done that, then I'll have your back. Right. And I think that's very important.
Which brings us back to that kind of micro activism that you were talking about, which is where you are, take up space, use your knowledge and your gifts to be able to model what it looks like to question authority. And we get to model that to our children in a way that will hopefully yield the kind of results that we know that are just. I'm curious about how in your own motherhood, you've had to almost release some of the internalized white supremacist ideology to kind of perhaps not over discipline children, or not to get them to strive, to be twice as good as everyone else. Some of those really key messages that we were raised with, how how did you model that, and how did you navigate that in yourself, whilst also kind of being present for your self-care and your own emotional well-being?
So I think because that was such a staple of my childhood, that as an adult, it's been so important for me not to pass that on. I wanted to make sure that I said how much I value and I'm grateful for my own parents, especially my mother, who wasn't a single mother, but because my dad worked at sea through most of my childhood, it essentially functioned as a single parent.
Yeah.
And was an immigrant to Wales, which is where I was born. You know, my parents come from East Africa. They immigrated to Wales, which is where they met, and they got married. And my mum essentially was raising me and my two younger brothers most of the time by herself.
In an all-white community, I'm sure.
All-white community, all-white schools. Also, we're Muslim, and we went to Roman Catholic schools. So we were always different. Everything about us was different. And she wanted to, and she did, instill a real sense of who we are, both our culture and our religion. And both my parents really valued education. So that was something that they really worked on with us. And I will say, and I know my brothers will agree with me on this, none of us would be where we are in life if not for my mother, especially, and the way that she really made sure that education was a top priority for us. Now, all that being said, and I hold that and I'm grateful for it, as an adult, I came to understand just how much pressure that put on us. And I'll speak for myself with this. I cannot speak for my brothers, but it put a lot of pressure. I've always been a student, so I love studying anyway. So it wasn't like I was being forced. I was kind of like the one who's like, give me more books, give me more learning. But what was hard, I think, was the feeling that it felt so high pressure to feel like I have to be the best. I have to be the top. And if I don't, like the stakes are so high that if I'm not, something terrible is going to happen. And they were raising us in a time where your education, especially, is how you could ensure that you could be successful in a world that did not want you to be successful.
Exactly.
Right. And so it mixed my love of education with this like feeling of pressure. And there was strictness. They came from Africa. There is a strictness around, raising us. I think because it was quite hard on me, that's never something that has come natural for me to want to pass on. And so for both my husband and I, we don't discipline in the same way that we were disciplined. We just don't. I think for us, it's really important for us to have conversations with our kids around their behavior. We give them, if you don't do this, then this is going to happen. And if it happens again,
consequences,
right? And helping them to understand that. What makes me laugh though now is that my parents, especially my mom, is so soft in her older age and hates when our kids have to deal with consequences and will advocate for them to be let out of grounding or whatever the case may be.
And you're like, Mom, what did you do to me? Come on, this is
so
easy.
Much more. So much more.
Exactly.
Just one day of being grounded. She's like, please, just let them out. Don't do this to them. Don't punish them. They didn't mean it. They won't do it again, which just always makes me laugh. And again, I'm really lucky. Our kids, they listen and they understand that when these things happen, I'm going to have to deal with this. But then the second piece that was very important to me was not instilling in them this sense of like, if you're not the best, if you don't do the best, I'm not going to be happy with you. We're not going to be happy with you. There's going to be consequences of some sort. So our constant affirmation to them is to do the best that you can do. And that has to be something that you self-assess. Like, do you really believe that you have worked as hard as you can, that you've tried as hard as you can? And if you have, then you have. There's nothing more that can be done. And I think that feels quite high risk for my mom, especially, who so values education. And what I've noticed is that my kids really have a sense of like self-motivation. And so they work hard because they want to do well for themselves, but at the same time, they don't put so much pressure on themselves that if it didn't work out, something terrible is going to happen. And I think it's because in the past, when when they were younger, they did. And I was like, where are they getting this from? We never pass on this message to them. And I'm like, oh, intergenerational trauma. That's where it comes from.
Exactly. It's in there somewhere.
It's in there somewhere. Yeah.
It's so interesting because what I'm hearing you speak to is that necessity in our mothering, in our parenting, to be constantly critical of like, what is ours that we've received that actually served us?
Yeah.
And what is it that we want to release in order to create space for something different?
Yeah.
And so as you are divesting from capitalism and white supremacy, some of those internalized messages are going to be so insidious that that voice is almost undetectable as like, this is something I don't want to pass down. It's like, you know, seeing my daughter make a mistake and the self-talk I have to say to be like, she's just getting it wrong. It's fine. I don't want her to not have the confidence to try again. Like hold back that judgment. That voice stays with me now. And I still have to work to overcome that negative self-talk. So I'm so conscious of like my natural default reaction in my parenting and having to take a pause from that and be like, oh, okay, this is what I've heard and has been spoken to me so many times. And that's why you end up repeating by default, you know, the things that you've heard as you've been raised. But actually, that's not the voice that I want my daughter or my son to internalize. And so I have to say something different in this moment with a different tone, maybe with a different volume. And so I think that, you know, gentle parenting for Black and brown mothers is coming into the mainstream now as a way that we can begin to kind of divest from all of these legacies of negative cycles that actually served our parents and pre-generations their survival. And so we're not judging those, but there is space now to do things differently that doesn't continue that cycle of harm and doesn't continue to crush them into a place of subordinates, but gives them space and freedom to be in their full self, to question authority, to say that doesn't make sense, to expect an apology if we've got something wrong, you know? And that piece feels like it's healing in progress. It's like, moment by moment, breath by breath. Let me unpack this before I reenact this, you know? And I feel like that's part of the spiritual, sacred blessing that we get as women and as mothers who are aware of that and have that consciousness to be able to filter it out and to not carry it on and to bring through the blessings and the things that have served us so that we can give our children those gifts as well.
I feel very grateful. I had my first child quite young. So I was like 24, 25 when I first became a mother. When you're saying about correcting things, I remembered it the other day that when my daughter would color, she would just be like, you know, all over. And I'd be like, actually,
can we restrain?
It has to be, you can't just layer colors on top of each other, you know. And I'm laughing inside because I'm noticing the ways in which I know that I've been healing through the years and how that allowed me to like release that grip on like, this is how things are supposed to be. It should be like this. It's supposed to be like that. And at the same time, the world is changing the way that it's changing, whether we want it to be or not. You have to learn to be adaptable with what is happening. We're not in control of the way that the world is changing, like en masse, right? We're not in control of that. But what we are in control of is how we choose to interact with it. And so even as we're raising our kids and we know that they are technology kids, right? We came online in our young adulthood. They're coming online from the beginning. So, you know,
this is their world.
This is their world. There has to be some adaptability around like, okay, this is a tool that it is a tool and it has advantages and it has disadvantages. And we know all of the studies around all the disadvantages that it has. But we also know that if the world is giving through this technology more access to information, more access to education, it's democratizing power in some ways as well, that it's our responsibility also to learn how to use these tools and also how to use them to connect with our kids as well. Right. So
we don't get closed out from the conversation.
Or think that they don't know what's happening in the world. They know what's happening because it's on their devices.
Yeah. And so I wonder if there was a gift that you would give to women listening who are at the threshold of navigating all of the things that we've been speaking about, depending on the ages of their children, and want to do it consciously, becoming a good ancestor, creating pathways for their children as their descendants. What's the one thing that you would say to them?
I think there's so many things that can be said. And I know we've been talking a lot around kind of like almost like the resistance part of activism, like almost like the like going against the system and like instilling these things in our kids. And that can feel quite militant in a way that feels maybe quite burdensome or quite distressing on the nervous system, let's say.
Effortful.
Right?
It's effortful.
Where I want us to end is about sustainable change making and sustainable activism. And that only comes through having first of all, a very long-term vision of the work. And I think parenthood gives you that, because you're going to be your kids' parents for all their lives. It doesn't matter how old they are. They're always going to be your baby. They're always going to be your child, right? So it gives us that long-term perspective. And also that sustainable change making, things like hope. We're talking about things like faith. We're talking about things like compassion and community and care for ourselves and for one another. It can't just all be go, 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 do, change, 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 that kind of an energy, because we will burn out. And what we will end up instilling in our kids is this idea of activism and change making that is quite burdensome for them to carry. And we do this already. We're always expecting like the young people to somehow save us and change the world. And they're much more idealistic than we are, and they're not as stuck in the systems as we are, but they're also just kids. Yeah. And they shouldn't have to carry that burden. And so the balance to that, the other side for them of that, is teaching them about the importance of joy and the importance of hope and the importance of care, and that is both how we parent and how we are in relationship with them, but also how they see us be in relationship with other people. So much more comes from how they see us be than what we tell them. I was having a conversation with someone recently, and I was talking about my mom, and I said, of course, I would do this because this is what I saw my mom do for her mom. This is what I saw my parents do for their parents. So they've never had to tell us that this is what we do, because that's what I saw. And they did it without expecting anything in return. It was just how they were. And that has made more of an impact, I think, than any kind of thing that when we're older, you need to do this and this and that first. No, like, of course I would, because I saw the way you did it and I saw how it brought you closer to your parents.
That's beautiful.
So of course I'm going to do that. So I think it's important not to underestimate what our kids see us do, and they'll call us on it anyway, right? They see us being out of integrity, right?
All the time.
They will call us on it. Yeah,
it's true. And I think that's the gift actually of having that voice, that kind of that questioning, that critical like, hang on a second, you said one thing, but you're doing something else, or you tell me to do this, but you're not doing it yourself. Yes. I think that's actually such a blessing, because it gives us that opportunity to embody at a deeper level, or own the fact that, okay, maybe I've set up an unrealistic expectation that I'm unable to live to myself. And it gives you a potential to really, to hear the wisdom that comes from these young ones, because they do see it all.
Yes.
And so I thank you for your time and your energy and your wisdom. It's been such a pleasure to connect with you. For people wanting to get in touch and to follow your work, where can we find you?
Absolutely. So it's been a pleasure for me too. And thank you for the just incredible questions and the work that you do. It's just beautiful. So thank you. So there's a couple of places. I have a Patreon. And so if you'd like to, follow my work and contribute to my work, that's patreon.com/become a good ancestor. I'm actually currently leading writing sessions, which are free community sessions. I'm writing. Yeah.
Tell me everything.
Yeah. So this is through a platform called Flown. flown.com. I found it last year when I was trying to figure out how to make my ADHD brain focus because I really struggle with executive dysfunction, and somebody recommended it as a place to do co-working and have that body doubling and accountability.
Amazing.
I was hooked from the beginning. And so I partnered with Flown to offer free community writing sessions. And I set them up because I'm writing my third book and I wanted the accountability for me to show up every day and work. And I also wanted to draw in and connect with a community of writers of all backgrounds, writing all kinds of things, who also wanted a dedicated space to write. And so it's called the Writing Cabin. The link for my sessions is flown.com/Layla F. Saad.
Perfect.
So anybody who's writing anything, you're writing a dissertation, you're writing a book, you're writing blogs, whatever the case may be, come and join us. We do 2-hour sessions, like 5 days a week.
I'm definitely going to be there for one. Can you give us any hints on what your third book is going to be about?
Absolutely. So, I've been doing this work around becoming a good ancestor for a few years now. And so this is kind of the culmination of that. It's essentially a manifesto for how we create change in the world, while also trying to protect ourselves from burnout. And so it's something that I've been both living into, but also studying and wanting to offer a place where, so many terrible things are happening in the world, and increasingly so, right? Increasingly so. And it feels like, what's the point for a lot of people, right? Because what power do I have to change the world? And so I really want us to reframe and recenter and reclaim our sense of power, and changing our ideas around what power can look like, that it doesn't have to be systemic or institutional power in order to make change, and that our power is the very thing that threatens the system. So going back to what we were talking about earlier and raising these free, liberated children, that's a sense of power. We're raising with a sense of power and it threatens the system. And so that's something that we should be tapping into for ourselves as well, and recognizing as something that can change the world.
Well, thank you for all of your work in this area, because I think it's a foundational place to begin in just how we navigate our world today and protect ourselves from burnout in a way that allows us the capacity to show up for the important work that we're here to do, and to embody the joy, the pleasure, the fun, the imagination that our ancestors have gifted us as well. So give thanks, Layla. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you, Nanda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to that episode of me and Layla F. Saad speaking about all things to do with motherhood, raising liberated Black children, and activism. What were the biggest takeaways for you? For me, I think it was really understanding that everything needs to be done incrementally, but with consistency and with this gentle approach that allows our children to remain innocent, to remain in their power and in their joy and in their freedom, whilst also challenging the status quo. Because that's how we're going to get real change, by having children who don't subscribe to the old paradigms, right? So for me, this was really a deep and far-reaching conversation, and it left me reflecting for days after I'd recorded this with Layla. So I'd love to hear what your biggest takeaway was. As always, join me on Instagram. My handle is @SoulMamaJourney. I love to hear your comments. I love to hear your thoughts, and if you have any questions, of course, follow Layla as well for more of her beautiful and important work. And share this with someone who you know is potentially navigating bringing up Black children in a white society, and want to do that in a way that feels conscious and liberating and empowering to them and their children. It's my hope these conversations go out to the women who need them, to the parents who need them. And so until next week, enjoy, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Blessings.